everybody. I'd like to welcome you to our SAPA webinar tonight. Some really good news. So tonight, our topic is on research, and I just want to just show you the topic tonight. So we're very lucky to have two excellent speakers, Professor Valerie Luckyx, who is based in Zurich. She's a South African, an adult nephrologist, soon to be working in pediatric nephrology, but she's my research whiz kid, and she's currently an honorary professor at UCT. And then we're going to be going to Dave Leroux, who's also very well known to everybody. He is also quite a varied person in that he studied at UCT and epidemiology at Johns Hopkins, and he's working as a general pediatrician while at Somerset while doing his PhD on childhood pneumonia. And he's passionate about understanding the determinants of children's illness and public health interventions. And he's done a lot of research as well. So for all those folks that are doing MMeds, MPhils, PhDs, or just interested in the science behind research, I'm hoping that we're going to give you a really great overview this afternoon without putting anybody to sleep. And so we're going to hand over to those two individuals in a second. The other really bit of good news is, and you can see the webinar behind, the slide behind me, is that SAPA has, after many, many months, and I'm almost going to say years, are eventually launching our new SAPA website. There's some individuals who deserve a lot of thanks for this, specifically Tanya and Ziad and Megan, but basically everybody in the executive have worked really, really hard at this. We're very, very excited. We encourage you to go and look at our website. It's a really easy address, pediatrics.org.za. We've been wanting to go live for many, many months, and today is the day that we're doing that. And we encourage you to join SAPA. It doesn't matter if you belong to any other organization, any other subspecialty in pediatrics, but we all, at the end of the day, working together for the health of children. And so we are extremely excited about our new website, and I'm going to bring that up again at the end. And then just a quick flash advert for the next time. It's interventional cardiology with an ECG quiz. But I'm going to stop sharing. I'm going to introduce Valerie to start off with. And Valerie, we really look forward to your presentation. I know it's pretty dynamic, and why don't you fire away and let us hear about your approach to research. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to do this presentation. I'm largely giving you a lot of experience that I've learned through trial and error in my own career. But as you will see at the bottom of many slides, I actually have links to some quite important, or interesting at least, guides and discussions about scientific writing. And I would encourage you to go to look at those. For example, this book is open access. So just to begin with, when we start scientific writing, we need to think about who reads what. And so here you can see on this cartoon that many people are going to read the title. Fewer people will read the abstract if they found your title inviting. And then if your abstract is appropriately written and conveying the correct information, the specifically interested people will go further and actually read the whole text. So basically, what's critical is that you want the right people to find your work. And that means you need to, especially in the title, include the right words, convey the right messages. And this is extremely important these days. If we want our work to be included in systematic reviews, which are the highest form of data, at least in clinical work, most of the time these large searches are including thousands of papers, and these thousands need to be rapidly screened, and most often papers will be included or excluded based on the title. So think about this. You want to convey good information in your title and not only have a catchy title. So why do we actually write papers? And I think the bottom line, we write papers because we've done some research and we want to ultimately contribute to science. We want to share ideas and ideally exchange ideas. Writing papers is also part of building one's reputation and building one's own credibility as a researcher and a communicator. And these two currencies are very often used if one wants to apply for promotion. One needs to show that one's being productive. Productivity and quality of research output is also used by grant funders to justify funding allocation and to justify funding expenses. One component that I feel is very important is that when we do a study, we should write it up. And I feel in a way that this is a respect of the participant. If you think about people who participate in clinical trials, many of them do not expect themselves to get a benefit. They're often participating thinking future people with their same diseases will be helped by their participation in a trial. So sometimes if the results are not exactly what the researcher was looking for, they don't publish. But I really feel that one owes it to the participants, and I feel publication of negative data is as important often as publication of positive data. So I generally think whenever one does a study, one should try to think about writing it up. Writing papers is also an important component of mentorship as one gets older, or learning if one is younger, and then hopefully also there's a component of fun. So what is good scientific writing? Basically should be clear, that people will understand what you're trying to say, should have a logical substructure, and I myself find that subheadings are actually very helpful. They help me to structure how I want to convey the information, but also I think do help in the reading. The information should be conveyed as simply as possible. I think figures and tables are often a lot easier to wrap one's head around than large masses of text. One needs to present one's results impartially and objectively. Even if they are disappointing, we need to put down exactly what we found and not try to color the results in any way, so that we are accurate in what we're portraying. This is also important in terms of the information we are communicating, but also in terms of one's own reputation. And we need to be sure that whatever we're presenting in our study is actually consistent, that pieces of data or statements do not necessarily contradict each other in the same paper. So this is a cartoon that I found on the internet, and more discussion can be found in the links. But this actually I found, just in a nutshell, puts the bottom line right there. If the average sentence is easy to understand, despite the fact that the subject matter is complex, this would be considered great writing. On the other end of the spectrum, if the average sentence is hard to understand, even if the subject matter is simple, the writing leaves a lot to be desired. Most of us are probably in these yellow phases, but we need to try to aspire to get into the green box. And how do we do this? So we need to choose the right words. We need to use appropriate words, technical words if necessary. We need to choose the same voice, active or passive, and use it throughout. Also, if we decide to use personal or impersonal statements, we need to use these also consistently throughout. We did this experiment, or this experiment was done. The tenses are important. Some people tend to write in the present, some in the past, but if the two are mixed, it gets a little bit frustrating to the reader. And then most critically, the content must be good and well communicated. So how do we start? So this is a infographic showing the anatomy of a scientific paper, which is really this funnel and inverse funnel shape. Again, there is a good explanation here on the web, but basically the component should be an introduction, what is known about the topic, also describing the knowledge gap to be filled, meaning what do we not know yet, and this sets up the rationale or hypothesis. Why am I doing the study? Why do I want to write this paper? And then the methodologies need to be accurate. What did you actually do? You then put down all your results, interpret from your methodologies, and then the discussion is interpretation of your results and putting this in context with what is already known. And finally, your conclusion is, what does this mean? What can we take from this, and how do we move forward? So first of all, in the conduct, you have to conduct a study if you're going to write up research. And the conduct of the study for me is very often a place where people fall down when they submit manuscripts, because if the study has not been well designed and well conducted, the quality of the data may not look robust, or the reviewers might be a bit suspicious. So it's very, very key that if you're going to do a project, think about it, plan it, discuss. Try to think, what controls do I need? What analysis do I need, so that the data that you generate is as robust as possible. Also, at the beginning stages, when you're planning a study, within your group, try to decide who's leading, who's going to be senior, where people will be in the authorship, so that later on, when you come to write up the study, you don't have people being disappointed and frictions. Then once you've conducted your study, you've gathered your data, you need to think, what are my main messages? I tend to put all my data as much as I can into figures and tables. This helps me to wrap my own head around the data. I often generate many more tables than I need, and sometimes land up merging tables or having to leave tables out or put them in the appendix. You then need to think, what journal do I want to choose? Where do I think my study will be best received, and who do I want to actually communicate with, which readers? And then once you've chosen the journal, you need to ensure you adhere to the instructions for authors. You need to then think, what exactly did we do? The methods need to be clear and reproducible. These are often in your grant proposal, for example. You also need to be very careful that you write a correct and explicit ethics statement. You then need to write up your results. I generally, from each figure or table, write a paragraph succinctly, try not to repeat too much in what I've written from what's in the table, and avoid too much interpretation of results in the results section. This comes up then in your discussion section, where you want to place your results in the context of what is known, state strengths and limitations, and the relevance. I then, at this stage, once I've got the meat of the study down, I go back to the introduction and think about how to massage my background so that it is short, concise, but conveying what was known and what are the knowledge gaps to justify why I did the study. I then need to think critically, what words am I going to use in my title, and how can I best write my abstract to put everything in a nutshell to capture an interested reader. And then finally, finish and format. Depending on what journal I've chosen, I need to include the number of keywords suggested, make sure always to include generous acknowledgements, disclosures, open, and the references should also be then correctly formatted according to the journal specifications. And if you want appendices or need appendices, then make sure these are also well formatted and clear. And then finally, when you're ready to submit, you need to generate a good cover letter, why your study's novel, why you're choosing this journal, and we'll discuss this a little bit more later on. So in the outline of the paper, you need to think main messages, figures, choose your journal. So in terms of choosing the journal, I'm using the example of the Journal of the American Society of Nephrology here. In general, on the website, you will find somewhere there is a tab for authors. You click on that. You will then find information for authors described in some form. You click on that, and usually comes as a large PDF that you can print, or you can read it online. This is just an example of an excerpt which shows how you're going to plan your study. You need to decide what type of study. Is this original research? Am I submitting a review? Is this a systematic review? Is it bench research, clinical research, etc.? You then need to look and see what is the word count that you're allowed for the text, for the abstract, how many figures and tables you're allowed, how many references you're allowed, so that when you actually submit the paper, the editor can see you've taken the time, you've understood what are the specifications of that journal, you're respecting the journal, and the editor will then think, yes, this is a serious author, I'm going to at least consider the paper. If it comes in looking totally different to what it should, the editors are often irritable. They receive a lot of submissions and they say, this person's not taking us seriously enough, we won't take them seriously. So you want to also adhere to existing guidance. And generally, if you've done a specific study, for example, a systematic review, you need to adhere to the PRISMA checklist. And this often needs to be included as well as an appendix in your submission. So now we go to the meat of the paper and we think the first thing would be the methods. What did you actually do? These need to be clear, such that somebody else in theory could reproduce your study. And in terms of the ethics statement, it's not just a checkbox to get your study okayed by the ethics committee. You really need to think, have I planned this? Have I considered all the ethical implications? Have I conducted it ethically? And now you want to present the data ethically. We then move on to the results. And as I mentioned, I would generate as many figures and tables as I could from the research results, and then try to write a short, succinct paragraph on each set of results. I try to avoid too much repetition. Very often people have all sorts of p-values or the number of males and females in the table, and then they repeat that again in the text. I don't feel this is necessary again in the text. Try to save the words in your results for meaningful statements that you're not able to put in the text or in the tables, excuse me, or sometimes if there is the data not included in the table, then it's reasonable to put in the text. So just think about how can you convey as much relevant information as succinctly as possible. And at this stage, you want to avoid too much interpretation of the results. You just say, we found X or Y, and you don't try to say what this means, because this will come up in the discussion. So when you go to the discussion, you always begin with a few sentences summarizing your main results, the basic conclusions of your study. You then go on to interpret the individual important results. I usually do that in chunks, try to take each section by itself. I interpret this objectively in the context of what is known and what is new. I specifically state this is consistent with the findings of others, or this is not consistent with the findings of others, but this is why I think, in my case, even though it's not consistent with previous findings, this is still a valid finding. So even if it looks like your data might not fit with the mainstream, if you can justify and really believe that your study was done well, state this in your discussion and stand up for what you found. Explaining potential discrepancies is important because this is open. It doesn't look like you're trying to hide anything. And it also helps in the interpretation of the prior knowledge. And for a reader, it helps to see where your data might actually fit into prior knowledge or might actually be new information. Critical in the discussion is stating strengths and limitations, because this is where reviewers often come up with critique. They say there's this and this and this limitation, and therefore this paper shouldn't be considered. But if you think about all your limitations up front and state these in the discussion, and if possible, interpreting these as strengths, because sometimes, for example, you may have a limitation, your sample size might be too small or may not have much power, but if you still had a significant result, you say, yes, we had a small sample, the power may not have been adequate, but that would have biased us towards the null. And we actually found a statistically significant result. And this probably means that our result may be even more statistically significant than we think. So that is a way to massage a limitation into, or at least showing that a limitation is also a potential strength. It's important so that the reviewers don't harp on these issues. You are stating them up front. You're not trying to hide anything. You then want to say, what is the relevance of what I found? What does this mean? And in your summary paragraph, you really want to say, well, how this should move forward. I personally would avoid vague statements like more research is needed, because I don't find that's helpful. I think try to make a very explicit statement. We are going to do the next study, or some other useful interpretation of your data, rather than just a vague more research is needed. And then, as I mentioned, I often go back to the introduction. Often you've thought about your introduction in your grant proposal or in your at least study planning. So you've done a lot of background reading. You just want to be succinct here, in a nutshell, state what is the status quo, where are the knowledge gaps, what is the justification for the study, and what is my hypothesis. You don't want this to be too long. Then, in terms of the literature review, this has to go into your entire study planning. You need to use the literature It helps to build your hypothesis, your background, your interpretation of the data. You also need to find literature to support the use of your methods. You often have to put references in the methods, the way you're going to analyze, and whatever literature you include, make sure that it's up to date. Don't mention papers from 2002 if there's a more relevant paper from 2018, for example. And as I mentioned earlier, as I'm going along, while I'm collecting all this data, or at least reading all this data, I collect it in my reference manager so that when I get to the actual writing, my references are all there ready. But find references on everything and reference whatever you feel is important in the paper. Then we go to the title and abstract. And as mentioned, we need to make sure that we choose the words carefully here so that we are capturing the right audience. And then we want to go on to finishing and formatting. And the choice of keywords is as important as the title and the abstract, because these keywords are also what are used in searches. So I tend to try to use words that are commonly used that other people would think about when they're looking for this particular topic. Doesn't mean only words. It can sometimes be phrases such as public health is 2 words, but it's a phrase, or glomerular filtration rate is again 3 words, but a keyword. So try to think how many you would need. Might be limited by the journal, but usually between 5 and 10. And again, choose them carefully, because this is what's going to make your paper show up in people's searches. Then be fair in your acknowledgements, be honest in your acknowledgements, don't overlook people, and then be honest and open in your disclosures, because this helps people to interpret the validity of your study. You don't want to give the impression that you are being swayed by a funder or some other particular interest in the way you're interpreting and presenting your results. The references then need to be carefully formatted per the journal style, and most journals will have a specific style. A lot of the reference managers have the specific style already there. And then format and present your appendices. These are often just PDFs that are attached separately when you submit. And then once your paper is ready and you've read through it and you've checked all the spelling mistakes, you hope, and made sure that you haven't missed things and that the language is comprehensible, you want to now write your cover letter. And the cover letter needs basically to try to convey to the editor that this is the next best thing. And if they don't take your paper, they're going to miss out. So why is your study novel? Why is it important that your study is published in this particular journal? Why do you want to reach those specific readers? And essentially emphasizing that this paper is important for the field and will have strong impact. So put the impact in your cover letter and really try to convince or convey to the editor that this is cutting edge and this would be of high interest to their specialized readers. You don't just say, dear editor, here is this paper, thank you for considering it. Put a little bit of meat, be a little bit of a salesman. And then once your paper has been accepted by the editor, sent out to reviewers, you will receive then a response to the reviewers. Sometimes these are enormously long and enormously disheartening. Your heart just sinks and you think, wow, I can never answer all of this. This person wants me to redo the whole study, rewrite the whole paper. Just really try to be rational when you go about this. So I often make a Word document with a table with 2 columns. On the left-hand side column, I take every single statement out of the reviewer's comments and I put them in one line, in one cell, so that I have an empty cell on the right-hand side and I can try to answer that specific comment. Very often you'll see that different reviewers will repeat the same comment. So that's quite easy. When you're responding to reviewer 2, you can say, as discussed in point 2 under reviewer 1, this issue has been addressed this way. So this way I find at least breaks down all the reviewers' comments into bite-sized chunks. If the critique is too severe, you don't have to answer every single reviewer's query, or at least you don't have to respond to that. You can often say to the editor, I understand where this review is coming from, but this critique is much too severe. Either I will not resubmit because of this, And this might actually be taken positively by the editor, showing you're standing by your results, you're a serious researcher. The editor might reconsider, or at least for the future, it'll leave a positive impression. So just remember, comments are not orders, and you should respond within reason. You can't be expected to redo the entire study. But if you are not going to respond to a reviewer's specific comment, just say, I thank the reviewer for this comment. I understand where he's coming from, but we are not responding in this way because either we don't have the data, we do not agree with this specific interpretation, etc. So be always polite, thank for constructive suggestions, defend yourself without being defensive, meaning stand by your data. And sometimes, however, you do have to admit that the reviewers make very good points. And in those cases, be gracious, be grateful, and amend your manuscript or improve your manuscript as suggested. And then what's also key is I often actually submit this table as my response to the reviewers, but you need to also highlight this in a tracked changes version of your manuscript, so the reviewer can very rapidly go and see where did you make the changes without having to reread the entire manuscript. And then be clear and direct in your responses. And just remember, if you are submitting elsewhere, if your paper eventually gets turned down, think about what did the reviewers tell you to do, be objective and say, yes, some of these comments might actually be constructive, and try to incorporate those before a resubmission, because you never know if you're going to get the same reviewer. And that can be quite frustrating to a reviewer when they once went through your paper, made suggestions, and then they see it again in the same state they saw it the previous time. So perseverance is definitely an enormous part of this. And just a few examples here. When I was working in Johannesburg, we started to work on traditional remedies in kidney disease. This was a totally non-interesting topic to anyone else besides us, it seemed at the time. Kept trying to submit to Western journals, and they kept saying, nobody's interested in this, we're not interested. Now it's become a big topic in many journals, but at that time it was almost impossible, and we finally had to go to the Central African Journal of Medicine, probably after having submitted to 10 different other journals. But the last two papers that I'm just illustrating here are actually wonderful experiences that I had to collaborate with a lot of experts in Africa. And we did some systematic reviews on outcomes of patients with kidney disease. This had never been done before. We had no budget. We did it all ourselves. We had no funding for publications, but we submitted to the Lancet Global Health. The editor was fantastic. And interestingly, the reviewers to both papers gave us a lot of feedback. We had to really persevere, really adapt. Interestingly, the feedback was contradictory in the two papers. So we tried to prepare the second paper thinking, how did the reviewer respond to the first paper? That wasn't the secret of success in that point. But the bottom line is we just kept persevering. We kept answering. We kept trying to present our data, stand up for our data. And in one case, for example, we're asked to produce a meta-analysis, but we really said we can do the meta-analysis. We actually did it, submitted it to the reviewers, but without including it in the paper, because we said many of these papers are so small, they are very descriptive. We cannot state that this data is necessarily robust, and therefore we're presenting the data as well as we can, very descriptively, but we feel that if we put too many numerical values on this data, it's going to artificially produce p-values that we don't think the data justifies. And interestingly, they bought that from us. So we were very lucky, very privileged to publish in these high impact journals, but a lot of this was really perseverance on our side, and a gracious editor who was willing at least to give us some time. So what's also very important is that a lot of this publication will come up in your track record, Web of Science, Scopus, ORCID. It's important that you keep track of these while you're going. Try to stick to the same email address so that you don't have multiple personae, and check periodically that these are up to date, so that when you want to apply for grants or apply for funding or promotions, your data is ready. And so finally, I've just listed some helpful websites here that hopefully can be helpful to you in your own scientific writing. There is quite a lot available on the web. As I mentioned, quite a lot is available open access, and definitely worth the read. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thank you, Valerie, very much. I must say a couple of things about Valerie. She makes research so exciting. Often people say it's boring, but whenever I listen to you, I think, oh, I want to get out there and go and do some research. So thank you very much. You've also taught me not to give up. And I think, you know, it's something we've tried to teach the group of fellows that you've been involved with, that when you get it turned down, not to go and hide under the table and cry your eyes out, but actually rise to the challenge. You've taught us how to make a table with a comment on the left-hand side and our responses on the right-hand side, which I think is amazing. And if we really, really don't agree, you've also taught us how to be cheeky in a very polite manner. So I just want to say thank you very much. I wish I'd had your lecture on a yearly basis before I started my research career. And I think we're going to hang on to you for that. So from my side, just thank you so much. And I know that the fellows at UCT who've worked with you have just absolutely loved it. I've watched them grow and it's been delightful. So thank you for your very present South African presence, even though you're miles away. It's amazing what Zoom can do. And I must say, COVID's been terrible, but there've been some advantages in terms of building up research skills. So any questions, guys? Is everybody just blown away by excitement and you're all thinking up new concepts and thoughts and you're ready to go out there? I don't think we've ever had 67 people on a research webinar, so on a Wednesday night. So I think you've really outdone yourself. I'm conscious of the fact that it's late for you as well. So if there aren't, we've got one question from Marti. So all these invitations from journals to publish with them, how do you know who's for real and who's not? That's an excellent question.
Yeah, I think that's a huge question. I would just start by looking and seeing, is this on PubMed, basically? You know, and just, do you know the journal? Because I think if you're working in a certain field and you've done a little bit of due diligence, meaning you've done a bit of background reading and things, you'll see that things turn up in similar places. If you're not sure, always ask somebody, because I think a lot of these journals, and especially if the journal wants you to pay something, I would be very suspicious if they're offering you to publish and to pay. So I think just be careful, try to look on PubMed and see if this thing is indexed. And if it's not indexed and you've never heard about it, I would just not trust it.
Great. And I know we get a lot of those. We really do get a lot of those. So it is. And sometimes I go and look up the impact factor and see if it's even registered. And I know recently we got a very, very sounding journal, but really not quite what it was written up to be. Then thank you for an excellent talk. May you please show the slide with helpful sites again? Thank you. So I think people, can you just drop back into your last slide? That's great. Valerie, just while we're waiting, we've recorded this and a lot of people have actually asked me if they could have a copy of your slides. Would that be all right with you?
I have no problem, because basically, I mean, a lot of this I've referenced, you know, and people can see that a lot of what I've referenced just to describe very similar things. So I have nothing, I don't think, I'm pretty sure I've referenced every single figure, etc., where I got it from. So I have no problem at all in sharing this. And my email is there, you know, if anyone has questions or whatever, just, you can feel free to ask if you have questions.
Great. Charlene is in Ghana, so she's one of our intensive care fellows. So she's also said very helpful talk. Thank you. Then another question, sorry, I missed that one. Should all the keywords be defined? That's an interesting one, because how many keywords do you have included?
I think very often they say sort of minimum of 5 or so. If they say only 5, then obviously you've got to choose 5. But if they, you know, I've seen sometimes 5 to 10 even. And I think the journal probably doesn't mind, because the journal itself is actually benefiting if somebody opens and downloads your paper. So, you know, the journal sort of wants your paper to be found, because they also have their own competitions and things, you know, and competitiveness, and their own impact factor will depend on how many times partly your paper gets looked at and downloaded, etc. So I wouldn't put hundreds, I wouldn't put more than probably 8 or 10 or so. But I think, like, for example, for us in nephrology, you've got the word kidney and renal and nephrology and whatever. So sometimes you have to put all 3. just in one paper, so that, you know, whoever uses one of those 3 words will find what you're looking for. And it doesn't have to be a word, actually. So you can use words like public health or social determinants of health, things like that, which are actually key phrases. But I think those are fine as well.
Brilliant. So Valerie, I think from my side, thank you so much. If you wouldn't mind stop sharing, that'd be great. Any final questions from anybody? So I'm just going to say thank you once again for joining us. I know it's been a crazy week for you as well, and we really enjoyed that. And we're now going to move on to Dave, but I'm just going to do